Well, I have one of the quarters and one of the semis recorded.
All rise for the Speaker of the House.
You may be seated.
Wasn't explained well.
I would like to welcome you all to this, the final round of the 2009 Hart House Invitational. Representing the government, we have the team from Alaska A, Prime Minister Michael Imson and Deputy Prime Minister James Killa. Representing Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, we have Leader of the Opposition Reva Gold and Deputy Leader of the Opposition Jake Liang. On Team Second Government, we have Sean Stefanik and Sarah Satrakian from McGill B. And finally, on Team Second Opposition, we have Daniel Westlake and Joshua Seeley-Harrington from UBC. Before the round, I would like to remind you that the opinions expressed by the debaters are not necessarily their own. And further, there will be no smoking, no taking of snuff, no discharging of firearms, no ringing of cell phones, or any other disruptive conduct in the House today. Without further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to the front to present the motion that stands in his name.
Honorable Speaker and members of this House, it is very rare to get the opportunity for something that achieves redemption or anything a second chance when it comes to modern civilization. It appears to be a part of the human condition that we would bring great hardship onto each other by necessity of our engagement. We would say that there is one opportunity now when it comes to individuals we have not yet encountered to begin with. Now, of course, by the nature of the resolution that we are given today, that this House would not contact undiscovered people. Clearly, we're not talking about an ongoing situation. Otherwise, these would be discovered people that we probably would have already contacted. But this is not a pure hypothetical. This has happened, in fact, very recently. And we would say that the effects have always been deleterious. We would say that there are two major points that allow us to substantiate that an obligation that exists not just for modern countries or for Western countries, but for all states, is if you are given any kind of notion of awareness, not full discovery obviously, of another group of individuals that have not yet been introduced into the modern world, you have a strong, powerful moral obligation not to engage them, not to contact. I believe that those 2 points would be to establish that there is inherent, measurable, and considerable harms in any such contact, no matter how it is structured. And we would also say that there are currently recognized positive obligations that we have towards indigenous people as members of the modern world. First, we would like to be able to say that there have been very recent instances of engagement. We would say that the Yanomami in Brazil is one example. We have also encountered a large number of previously undiscovered or unencountered people on small islands, both in the South Pacific and also in the Atlantic. We would say that when contact is made in these cases, there are a few relatively predictable results. Obviously, prior historical examples are usually fairly malicious forms of encounter. We don't say that it has to be that way. Even benign intentions have had disastrous consequences. In the case where we have a problem of observation, anthropologists attempted to engage individuals who are part of these tribes within the Amazon and within Brazil. The consequence was a total destruction of their culture, a complete destruction of their civilization. Hunter-gatherer civilizations that don't have written language, that don't have access to modern goods, tend not to endure particularly well when they are introduced to all the modern conveniences that one can imagine. The mere presence of a white anthropologist proved itself to be immensely disruptive. We would say that the problem observation is one that by simply attempting to observe a previously undiscovered people, you fundamentally change them. We have an obligation not to destroy these cultures. If our observation of them does so, we cannot observe them. Sir?
If someone offered you a cure to cancer, but you had to change your culture, would you take it?
Well, here's what I would say, first off, that we recognize that we, actually, you know what, I'll tell you what, I'm going to answer to my second question. That'll be more succinct. So, if we recognize that this does do measurable harm in the capacity of culture, we would also say that it does harm in terms of what happens physically. First off, most of these civilizations have no exposure to modern diseases or anything that's encountered in the Western world. So if you're going to ask me, would you take a cure for cancer, I also wouldn't take access to the modern influenza or anything of that sort, which is proven to be absolutely disastrous. Now, we'd also say that to the extent that you expose individuals to this, I am not so naive as to believe that there is no way to compensate for that. You can have an immunization program. You can have state programs and assistance to be able to provide food and water to compensate for destructive habitat. And at that point, those are no longer the Yanomami. Those are individuals that now live on a reservation, and that has not been a beneficial arrangement. We would note that even in the modern world where we attempt to have benign or outright positive engagement with indigenous populations, there is no medicinal cure for the destruction of culture. And we would also note that at least the United States is one example, even in the modern day, the highest suicide rates, the higher murder rates, the highest rates of substance abuse are found in indigenous communities. There is a reason for this, and it is something that is not solvable by science alone. So,
do we not also have an obligation to uphold the human rights standards that a majority of our global society do stand for and try to uphold in other societies?
Well, I guess what you would say, to what point does that standard extend? And I believe that I can answer this as well as our colleague's question in the second point. What are our positive obligations? We recognize that there is an obligation to be able to preserve culture, as I said, but also a people as a whole. We would note that the definition of genocide that is offered by the United Nations is that it's any destruction of a people, the taking of their children, the deliberate removal of them from their society and their home. What happens when you have a people that are inherently incompatible with the society that you have? That the mere exposure destroys that. Ladies and gentlemen, I would most certainly never accuse side opposition of being genocidal maniacs. They're nice people, I like all of them. But what this would amount to, and what it has amounted to, has been an unintentional and tragic form of genocide nonetheless. I would ask, do the standards of living, does the nature of that intergenerational project of these indigenous civilizations, do they improve as a result of their contact? Yes, modern conveniences can be introduced, as well as modern problems. And those incompatibilities, if they can persist after generations, after centuries, with other groups, we would note that the problems that are faced by the Yanomami now are far greater than even other groups that are currently within the bounds of modern civilizations. We would say that to the extent that you do this, you do irreparable harm, and especially when you consider the fact that we now know what the consequences are of engagement. We know that there is no effective means with which to do it. Now, we would say that a part that we hope about the human condition is that we may not be perfectible as a species, but that we can learn from our mistakes. And it is a grand moral obligation not to perform the same atrocities that we have time and time again. And we know from historical fact and record that even well-meaning, it does nothing to avert those harms. The most benign, most positive intentions can produce this, and we would say that accepting that, most of the cases in which we're talking about engagement, it is impossible to have even pure benign intentions. Let's bring one more link back to the Amazon. We would say that there are grand resources that are contained within the Amazon. And as far as being able to incorporate them into a modern society where you'd be able to compensate for the harms of your introduction, there are capricious and predatory elements within every society. It is pretty hard to be able to restrain individuals' financial desires, the desire to be able to exploit others. We would challenge opposition to show us how we could possibly engage on this level. And perhaps a historical example where we have not, as a people, as a civilization, been predacious when we encounter a previously undiscovered people, in which we have not been harmful to their intentions, to their efforts, and to their best interests. We would say that there is a clear obligation for all states. Do not contact individuals yet to be discovered by civilization. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his speech and invite the Leader of the Opposition to approach the front for her 7-minute address.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We kinda like exploitation, actually. We actually kind of like it. We don't think there's a problem with it. We think it's in our interest to exploit. But seriously though, we think that there are good things for the undiscovered peoples too of this kind of interaction. We're gonna give you a whole bunch of reasons why we think we have why it's not only good for them, but why we actually think we have some kind of duty and some kind of moral obligation to seek contact, to get this kind of information, because by simple virtue of being humans and not aliens, which we were really worried the model might be, so we're glad for that human word in the resolution, we think that they do have certain rights that we must make sure are there. We also think there are a lot of benefits to us of doing this, and we do think that we should be a little bit self-interested sometimes, right? So what is our obligation? So in recognition that they are humans, we do think that generally speaking, we have some kind of duty to investigate that if they are being seriously mistreated and seriously harmed and seriously violated in some way, we do generally intervene, right? So we give aid to African countries that are really poor sometimes, right? Or we intervene militarily when we think that a government is repressing its people if we can do so. So we think that we do have certain duties to make sure that rights are maintained, and to the extent that we don't contact them, we have no way of knowing that they're not repressed. There's no check on their sort of system. We think we have a duty to make sure they're okay and contact them. We think that they themselves are not free unless they know what their alternatives are, Mr. Speaker, unless they know that there's another society that they can opt into should they so choose. We think that's our duty to them. What are the benefits for us? Because we think that's important in this round. So we think that we have, first of all, contact establishes everything, right? Without communication, without a full understanding and appreciation of what they are, there's no way to open any channel of any kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. We think cultural sharing is good, particularly Team Jake Liang and myself. So we think that, broadly speaking, if you want to gain anything, we're not saying contact them and then necessarily have some kind of exchange, right? We think the point where you contact them and start some form of interaction is the necessary precondition for anything that can be of benefit to both peoples. So, if we don't want to rape and pillage their lands, we won't do so, right? They're well, there's no examples of it ever working. Give us an example of when we've actually tried with benign intentions, guys. We think that every time we've contacted before, it's because we've had bad intentions a lot of the time. That's fine. Do it, just don't steal from them. We think that's pretty clear. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, we want to talk to you about the evolution of culture, because we think, generally speaking, it is a good for cultures to interact with other cultures. We think that's how they take and adapt the best parts. That's how many great civilizations have evolved and shared from each other. We think that's why they do very well. So we think that, sure, some cultures, like the Aboriginals you brought up, sure, they suffered. That's because we didn't, mutually engage in a mutually beneficial one. We just took their land. I take you at the end of this point. We think that cultures are better to the extent that they're free to adapt the best elements of others to their own traditions. We think this is how it's always happened. We think it's good.
The Yanomami were initially engaged by anthropologists, not necessarily the most militant of types. It was supposed to be a pot of engagement, but it didn't work out. That would be an example. Could you respond?
Okay, yeah, because the project of anthropology was never a benign project, right? Anthropology started out, it was the British trying to justify all kinds of colonial oppression, right? Anthropology is not this neutral benign exercise. That's ridiculous. What did we hear from the Prime Minister? We heard we need a chance for redemption. We think the chance for redemption is actually having a beneficial interaction with them, not having no interaction whatsoever. So what do they tell us? They're look, usually it has disastrous consequences because we destroy their culture, and they lose their language and they lose certain cultural elements. Well, first of all, we don't see what's inherently bad about a culture changing or even losing a language. We think that's their burden to prove to us, because we don't think, we think that if a people decides that they would like to speak another language or adopt different cultural traits, that's fine, that's good for them. We care about human rights. We don't see any good reason for that. We think if they see aspects of our culture, they should be able to take them. And then they're well, even with benign attempts, it's bad, there's no way to restrain our exploitation. Well, so if it's exploitative and we gain some kind of benefits, maybe that's a reason for us to do it. If we want to be exploitative, because we do think we have to consider our self-interest. But more importantly, we do think that attitudes have changed substantially in the sort of post-colonial context with this kind of recognition of our historical wrongs. And the way to write this is by positive engagement, not isolation from these people, right? So then they're look, genocide is the destruction of a people. We're not calling you genociders, but really we kind of are. And then they're we think that the problem with genocide is living humans are dying. We don't think the problem is the death of a culture. We think the problem with genocide is the death of a people, right? So we don't think there's anything inherently bad in a culture dying. We think it's good for cultures to interact and accept the best elements. We're going to stand by that. Then they're look, suicide rates are really high amongst indigenous persons. We think that's because we took their land and screwed them over, not because we contacted them, right? And we continue to do so. How do we write that? It's not by not contacting other people. It's really weird that it's we should redeem ourselves to these people who we've oppressed by not contacting an unrelated new population. That's just kind of a weird model for redemption in the first place. But what if we told you today? We think that by virtue of the fact that you know that there are some people with no measurable check on their freedom, we have the duty to show them that there are alternative options should they want to opt out, right? We think it's okay for people to opt into cultural systems that we might think are oppressive, at least if we know there is some kind of opt out. And moreover, we think we have a duty to investigate hard oppression in the case that we do need to actually give these people aid. Furthermore, we think that there are a lot of benefits to ourselves and to them through this kind of cultural engagement. We think that contact can establish commercial trade. We think that we can share math and numerical systems that are seriously important. We think we can share medicine. We think we can share institutional resources and capability. We think generally the spread of information is a good thing. Have there been wrongs? Well, yeah, but sometimes they've worked out to our benefit. So we think that if we want to do that, maybe we should. But even from the perspective of is it good for these people, we think that there's nothing inherently bad in contacting every time. Their burden is to show why we must absolutely never be allowed to do this. We think there's no reason we couldn't do it for a good intention either. We're proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for her speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to approach the front to continue the case for side government.
Thank you, wise speaker. Gender neutral, it's good. We're messing that up. There are three questions which we have at this point in today's debate. I'm going to go through all of them. I appreciate the clash we were given by first opposition. There's a question of obligation. What obligations do states have to indigenous peoples? There's a question of what happens. First opposition wasn't really into actually drawing out some plausible scenario, more just saying this could happen and that might be okay in that circumstance. I don't think they made that argument successfully. And lastly, I want to kind of deal with this question of universal rights, which we predicted would come up, this notion that we have some kind of obligation as liberal actors to not only exploit people's goods, but also to export our ideals into their societies, and that hopefully they will still argue that would need to be beneficial to them in some way. I think we'll show that it's not. So let's start with the question of obligation. Now, Michael gave you the understanding of positive obligation descriptively and also normatively. We say that in the United States and Canada, we see a normative and descriptive obligation has been established to protect the rights of self-identification for indigenous peoples. There's a certain amount of independence, a certain amount of sovereignty. That has been accepted. We don't say you need to accept all of our values wholesale. We do not have a policy of complete and total assimilation within our normative context. We recognize a certain degree of independence and an obligation the state has to respect that independence and that autonomy and their willingness. What we recognize is that we have a unique opportunity in the context of this debate round, and that is not to try to establish that after smallpox, not to try to establish that after dramatic bouts of exploitation, but to prevent those harms from occurring in the first place. That's why we propose in terms of the obligation, because we believe that that obligation already exists, and here is an opportunity to provide an iteration of that obligation which does not have to inflict serious harm upon these peoples in the first place. So we think their obligation was this on-site opposition. We have a duty to investigate to make sure they're okay. You guys doing all right? You chilling? Everything cool in the indigenous community? I don't think that's a very serious description of an obligation that a state has. I think maybe your investigation would be better off starting to go to the history books and look what has happened when you've done this kind of investigation just to check things out, make sure they're okay. Even when you've had these nefarious anthropologists go in there, what with their lack of moral relativism and all, when they go in there, we pointed out that the Yanomami were destroyed. Not very many of them exist today, and that began as a totally benign effort. So in terms of their understanding of the obligation, they just want to go investigate. We would say the investigation into history shows us that such an investigation almost always does harm. And until they give us example or some analysis suggests otherwise, we will stand by that point. So the second question is, what actually happens in these cases? They say, well, we're kind of down with exploitation. I'm not sure why they had to make that argument, but they did. We think that it benefits us on some level. And then we got some generic stuff like cultural exchange is cool. Without communication, you can't talk. Things like that, and talking would be good. Again, if you're going to try to win this argument, you need to explain. We've said this is a uniquely vulnerable group to this kind of cultural interaction because it absolutely destroys the culture and has in every historical example of this occurring. It has decimated these people physically, spiritually, and culturally. Talking hasn't been good. So simply saying, like on some theoretical level, that we like communication is not sufficient to win this, is beneficial to us. Also, I'm guessing it's beneficial on the level of resource exploitation. Yeah, we ought to take those reservations back that we gave to the Indians. There might be some good research there. Oh, there aren't. We didn't give them good reservations. I'm simply saying, I don't think that's a good point, that you just want to exploit them, and that's beneficial to us on some level. We think our obligation that we've described overrides. And lastly, they say that the best model available is one where you have neither exploitation, even though they defended it, and neither this kind of autonomy, but rather this dynamic synthesis, this bringing together, strengthening of cultures. First of all, I have a question. Can such a synthesis take place? I would say absolutely not, because in order for synthesis to be a thesis and an antithesis, which are at relatively equal levels or somewhat equal levels, for there to be a cultural integration. There is such disproportionate power and influence between native or these indigenous groups that have not been contacted and the people that have militaries and guns and corporations to go in there and exploit them, that there's not going to be any synthesis. There's no real interest in synthesis that would occur on this level. And secondly, it's never happened, which explains why my first point was good. Okay, so we don't think there's going to be a synthesis. Lastly, let me deal with this question of universal rights, which is what second opposition is going to talk a lot about. Now, essentially, their argument here is going to be that bad things might be happening in these places. There might not be a full expression of women's rights. There may not be suffrage. People might not be voting all the time. We may have an authoritarian system. Things like that. So let's deal with that really quickly. First of all, I would say Go ahead, sir.
Okay, what is the value of culture to an individual within that culture if they don't have the agency to express that culture in the way they want?
Right, so that is an incredibly Western nefarious anthropologist view of agency within this context. We would say that your agency is more debilitated when you exist within a population that has the highest rate of suicide, of murder, and of substance abuse within that community post-contact than it does within that group. The absolute empirical harm that is done to them outweighs. And that's essentially the point I was going to make. If you want to say that we believe in normative universal rights, we would say one of them that we recognize is cultural identification. That is a very strong one and is unique in this case because we have an ability to maintain the cultural identification these people have, which we know descriptively will be destroyed if we allow for this contact. But secondly, if you want to ignore that right to cultural identification and just say, as a policymaker, what are the predictable outcomes of this policy, then you would say that we don't think dying is a good thing, that's a harm, that we don't think you getting smallpox is a good thing, that's a harm. Lastly, I forgot to deal with something and I want to touch on it before, I don't know what my time is, but I want to talk about this really quickly. They said, what if we were able to do this in some kind of benign way? There's some kind of good, and it's never been tried before. They challenge us. Think of an example where someone has, with benign intentions, approached a native community or indigenous community, and we would say Jefferson was really into noble savages, and he called them noble for a reason, and he had every intention. He kind of bought into the Rousseauian idea that these people were somehow more pure than the colonizers that were coming in. Smallpox, blankets, things like that were the result of. It's not to say, even the anthropologists themselves, benign intentions, as we have demonstrated, are not sufficient to guarantee against the kinds of harms that we're talking about. So what have we told you about opening government? We've said that there is a significant obligation which exists, that exists descriptively, and even if it didn't exist descriptively, should exist normatively. Secondly, we've described that and told you that the result of our history, the results of our understanding of these indigenous peoples, is that immeasurable harm is done to them culturally, physically, on every single level. You have no medicine to protect this culture. You have no blankets that you can give them, even if they don't have smallpox on them. I'm sorry about that joke already. And very lastly, for all these reasons, what we see is that because harms are done, because they can't give us an example where harms would not be done, and because an obligation exists in a very substantive way, we beg you to propose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to approach the front for his 7-minute address to the House.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So what first proposition presents us with is with many examples where bad consequences followed from bad plans. What are Reva and I going to say? We're going to say contact is not what makes a plan bad. Contact is a basic part of any type of plan for cultural interaction. We can envision good plans being instituted that don't involve giving people blankets full of smallpox so that they will die, Madam Speaker, that don't involve observing people so that they cannot live their lives out and so that their culture must not live on. We think that we can adapt our measures. We think, furthermore, that when you adapt those measures, you achieve significant benefits for the people involved and for us as a whole. I'm going to talk about three things, so three separate themes that I'll fit things under. Firstly, I'm going to talk about cultural freedom. Secondly, I'm going to talk about duties to protect and human rights to choose. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about benefits to us, because there's a lot. Okay, so on to the first point, Madam Speaker, on cultural freedom. Firstly, Reva and I present to you a model of why such freedom matters at all. Because we don't care about a culture insofar as it exists as a static thing. We care about it as to how humans interact with that culture, as to how it helps them realize desirable life experiences and understand the world around them. What does that matter in this case, Madam Speaker? It matters because we put to you that a culture can change and still achieve all of those benefits for its people. We put to you that the value of a culture is not that it itself is frozen in time, but rather that it adapts as necessary to best serve the people who it belongs to. Go ahead.
But Jake, given that we don't have access to any other cultures that are frozen this way, isn't it a huge loss to us in terms of knowledge for that culture to disappear?
Okay, sit down. Madam Speaker, it's interesting they say this, because what is more likely for a culture to disappear? Under our model, we establish contact. Maybe we record the culture as it was in that point in time. We have archival evidence that we can study forever. Under their model, they don't establish contact. If the people are wiped out, we will never know what the culture was. We will never be able to understand it. We will never realize any gains from it. They will be lost to the sands of time. We think that is a benefit on our side of the house because you can record the culture if you want it as a snapshot. We don't think that a snapshot is ultimately what we want, though. Furthermore, what Reeve is saying is that cultures require interaction to evolve and to adapt and to ultimately be meaningful for their people. If we thought that we'd have to listen to Madonna for the next 1,000 years, I don't think that's a successful realization of culture. I think we want to discover new things, to incorporate new things in our culture, new technologies. I'd also make the claim, Madam Speaker, that technology and culture can be integrated without destroying the essence of what that culture is. So, for example, the Inuit in the north use snowmobiles to hunt, but whereas the essence of the culture was the hunting itself, not the fact that you had to risk your life and limb in order to do so. We think the technology actually improves the realization of that culture so far it is valuable to people. Secondly, I want to talk about the duty of protection. Reeve and I put to you very simply, the question is, are they okay? Are they okay under two aspects? The first is human rights, and they poo-poo this, right? They say, well, look, they can't vote in elections. There can be serious, egregious harms that are much worse than you not having your democratic rights. So, for example, one segment of the population might be subjugating another segment of the population. Now, Reeve and I recognize that you often do not interact with other cultures to restrict this right. It's just something we're not comfortable with. But, Madam Speaker, in the possibility that there is something that is so egregious that you must intervene, we think that possibility means an absolute duty because the wrong is so wrong. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, sit down. We would sit down, you two. Madam Speaker, we would say, in a sense, asking someone if they are okay means asking them if they are okay with the quality of life which they currently enjoy. So I asked on a POI, actually, say like an advanced spacefaring human culture asked us, do you want the cure to cancer? Do you want to be able to live for a much longer time? I think we'd at least want to be able to make that choice ourselves, Madam Speaker. I think if we want to be considered as free people, we need to know what our different opportunities are. To be free is to be able to make the decision as to whether you accept a technology or not, because maybe you do value that more. Maybe the consequences, furthermore, of not being subject to these types of harm in your daily life are more important to you. Go ahead.
If the great travesty that you can envision is some kind of exploitation occurring within that indigenous community, and we've established that it's exactly what will occur upon contact, you have done nothing.
Madam Speaker, okay, so let's talk about the actual effects on the indigenous community itself. What we propose to you is that probably most of the effects will be good. What they propose to you is that it must always be bad. Let's look at the only example we have, which is imperfect, but we think still has value. So let's say culture, interacting with North American native peoples, Madam Speaker. So we would say, first of all, you do observe that even when we were very, very evil, even when we did do things like give them smallpox and colonize and steal their resource, which Reeve and I absolutely do not stand for, right? But even in that case, you do see aspects where the quality of life of many people has been improved. To return to this example of being able to hunt without freezing your arm off, we think that is an unquestionable improvement in the quality of life. We don't think it necessarily means that the net effects are bad. So far as you're worried about smallpox, so far as you're worried about medicinal problems, we think modern science can take care of it. Well, you know what we're going to say? Our claim to that is modern science can take care of it, that we can be very, very careful. Sit down. Finally, I want to talk about the third thing in this round, the benefits to us. Because we also want to question the premise that it is only we who can give good to these cultures. We think that communication is necessary. Recall that's the right. Communication is necessary because we also have the opportunity to learn, to advance ourselves, to explore, to understand new aspects of what it means to be human. Because what is salient here? What is salient is how important the perspective of your individual position is when you're considering ideas. We think what interaction gives is possibly a unique opportunity to create a new branch of our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of how we develop. We think interacting with other undiscovered humans is an important part of how we become human ourselves. This is the most important benefit in the round. We furthermore think maybe you have medicinal discoveries, other types of discoveries, cool things that they've discovered. They could be really good. So recognize what we've brought to the round today, Madam Speaker. We've brought three important imperatives. The first is the cultural freedom. Second, duty to protect. And third, benefits to us. We're proud to oppose. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his speech and ask the first member of the second proposition to approach the front for his 7-minute address.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So I have three things I'd like to discuss. The first thing is, what are conceptions of the self and how do they matter in this round? So I'm going to posit two things to you. First, I would say, Madam Speaker, is that how we conceive of ourselves as humans is fundamentally related to how we interact with our surroundings, what we know about our surroundings, and what we know about our existence in relation to other people. So here's the harm, Mr. Speaker. As soon as you introduce the idea into these undiscovered cultures that other things exist, that other cultures exist, and that other people exist, that completely alters their metaphysical understanding of the way they exist, the way they live their lives, and the way the world works, Madam Speaker. This is a harm that is irrespective of what model Jake thinks will work, right? It is a harm that is associated directly with contact in any of its forms, Madam Speaker. It is harm that is significant, and also note, it is a harm that is irreversible, because you can't go back and change the fact that you exposed them to all these new things and made them question their identity. If I, for instance, Madam Speaker, found out that there are aliens out there, I'd be really, really weirded out and have a lot of existential angst about what my life is all about. And as soon as you introduce all of these undiscovered cultures into these brand new worlds of things that exist, I think that seriously harms their ability to survive. But second thing I would posit to you, Madam Speaker, is that the survivals of these conceptions of self require some sort of critical mass in order to work. So we would say, Madam Speaker, we're probably going to assume that these cultures are small groups of people on the earth, since we haven't discovered them already. At the point at which they are so small relative to other overarching cultures, we think this impedes their ability to survive after interaction. If we look at people like Aboriginals, for example, they were harmed by the very knowledge of the existence of others, and then we started bribing them to get all sorts of things from them. I think that was really bad, Madam Speaker. No thanks. So what we essentially see here is some sort of numbers game. By exposing to ourselves to them, there necessarily exist these harms. But if contact is going to happen, Madam Speaker, how should it occur? Because I think what we would say, Madam Speaker, is if contact is inevitable, it ought to be initiated by the undiscovered smaller cultures rather than the Western world or us in general. Because one, by doing it on their own volition, Madam Speaker, I think we seem a lot less threatening. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. No thanks. But two, Madam Speaker, we let them control the terms of engagement, which I think is a lot better in terms of allowing them to preserve their own culture in at least some way. We recognize that their existence will be changed by discovering us, but they can control the nature of those changes by controlling the terms of agreement, Madam Speaker. We think when you have asymmetries in power between cultures based on number and based on just how big they are, how they survive, that's kind of problematic. Second thing I want to talk about is how can we decide what's best? Because I don't think we can assume these people have the same value system, Madam Speaker. If you look at cultures we know about, there are huge differences between like Confucianism in the 1900s and the kinds of cultures that existed in Europe or South America. They were completely different in how you conceive of things. So I don't think you can do this. Moreover, Madam Speaker, I would say that our idea of what the good is always changes. If we had this debate a century ago, this would be an argument, Madam Speaker, for civilizing Aboriginals because we don't think they're civilized and introducing all sorts of our new technological advances. So I don't think you can empirically say that what we have now is absolutely better. I think that's always relative, always to be decided by people. These people don't get the choice when you initiate contact with them, Madam Speaker. That contact changes their culture, that's not something they can control. But moreover, how are they going to respond if we do suddenly go and interact with them, Madam Speaker? I think a lot of them are probably going to feel really, really threatened and are probably going to oppose it to the extent where they're willing to fight, wage violence. This isn't good for their culture, this isn't good for all culture, and all of Ops benefits assume a productive dialogue between these two cultures, which I don't think you're ever necessarily going to get. That's a problem they've overlooked. Josh.
If global warming is sinking the sole island on which my culture exists, do you think that voice and its existence is important in international environmental dialogue?
That's the concern we want to talk about in this way. I think first off that you underestimate the abilities of cultures to survive and adapt. I mean, to the extent that we survive all sorts of natural disasters and challenges, I don't think it's necessarily true that they won't either. So I don't agree with that. But second, thirdly, I suppose, is there some sort of benefit to us? Because first off, I'd say we've gone along this far without knowing about them. I think we're okay in terms of our epistemological evidence and knowledge that it's a marginal benefit at best, right? Because I think we have a lot of cultures to study, a lot of cultures to understand. I don't know if it would that fundamentally change our knowledge of everything, as Jake and Reeve will go on to believe. But moreover, Madam Speaker, we're perfectly fine that if you did have the ability to study them without interacting with them, I don't know, like satellite photos or something, I'm not very technologically advanced, but if we could work on those sorts of things, we might be okay with that to get those benefits, Madam Speaker, assuming that you don't interact with them and that you don't cause some sort of harm in that respect. So I think these benefits aren't necessarily exclusive. We can get them from other areas if that's what you're concerned about. No thanks. Let's get into some reputations. We hear some interesting things from Jake and Reva. The first thing is about what do we do? Okay, well, the first thing I want to point out is that I think there's a distinction between existing cultures that already interact with each other and cultures that are undiscovered and have never interacted with each other. Because I think a lot of their arguments are valid in terms of the cultures that already exist and already interact, but don't necessarily work with these ones. I'm going to get to that in a second. But let's look at their argument about we ought to help them out if they're genociding each other. A couple of things. First off, to the extent that we assume that they're one cohesive cultural unit, I don't see why you're going to get genocide happening all of a sudden, Madam Speaker. But secondly, I don't think that's a very self-sustaining method for them, because I think, like, to some extent, they're probably interested in preserving their own human life, right? So I think we underestimate their ability to do this out. I don't know why we're just all assuming in this round that they're killing each other, but that doesn't really work. But Reva gives us a couple of other things. She says that these individuals can opt out of interaction if they choose to. That's what my extension's about, Madam Speaker, because no, they can. At the point at which you initiate contact, that is irreversible and that is out of the control of the individuals in question. It is in our control, right? So that's a harm that doesn't go away no matter what. They talked about cultural adaptation through interaction. And here's the thing, Madam Speaker. This might be true for cultures that already exist and have already established themselves, but at the point at which you're talking about cultures that are isolated and don't have this interaction, Madam Speaker, I think you get negative impacts by introducing that upon them. We saw that with Aboriginals. They might still exist as people today, but their cultures are fundamentally different and fundamentally lost some sort of value or tradition. So even if you accept that's a benefit, I think we should let them discover us. And other things I just want to briefly mention is, no, Reva, we didn't intervene in Darfur, we didn't do much in Somalia, we didn't do much in Myanmar, we didn't do much in North Korea, so I'm not sure where she's basing these claims on. But moreover, I'd say these individuals don't have fundamentally different, like we're not challenging their metaphysical existence by intervening in those situations, so that doesn't work. This is sort of just going through op case generally. They talked about this idea about how we care about culture because of humans interact, Madam Speaker. I think our issue about the distinction between discovered cultures and undiscovered cultures negate that. Jake tells us that cultures can change. They can also change and adapt without interaction with us, Madam Speaker. I don't think this is a benefit that only comes by exposing them to Western civilization. And moreover, we'd say it's probably not going to be good changes. Sure, you can archive it, Madam Speaker. That doesn't do much good for preserving the existence and culture for these people, which is what we're concerned about. So for all these reasons, we're proud of this.
I'd like to thank the member for his speech and invite the first speaker from second opposition to approach the front for his 7-minute address.
Okay, Madam Speaker, I think there are three big issues that we need to discuss in terms of an extension on side second opposition. The first thing I want to talk about is the nature of the globalized world and what impacts humans have now in the world we have. The second thing I want to talk about is the value of culture and do some analysis about what judgments these people can make. And the third thing I want to kind of address is, can we do this in a way that is fair and sustainable and doesn't destroy their cultures? So let's get to this. Josh gets up on a POI and says what if the island is sinking and we need to help them move off, or need to tell them that their island is sinking because we've created so much pollution and global warming that we've caused problems there. And Sean just basically says this doesn't matter to the round. It's not an existential crisis that you have if your island is sinking. It's like a physical crisis that's going to destroy your entire society. I think in cases where we're perpetuating that kind of thing, we have a duty to inform these groups that we're perpetuating that kind of pollution, that we're putting them in a situation in which they are in great danger. We think we have that responsibility requires us to intervene. We think because we're the ones causing global warming, because a lot of our actions in the globalized world beyond that have impacts on the entire planet and change the way that other people are living, we have a duty to let people know about these different interactions. And we see because of this a necessity that comes from interacting with individuals so that we understand, where global interaction is happening. And this doesn't have to be forcible, right? We can tell them that the island is sinking because of various different things and just offer to move them off. And they say, no, we value our culture more. We say, fine, go.
Thanks. So what you're saying is that when an indigenous people have come into contact with a horrible thing that we've unleashed, then we should give them a heads up. Do you believe that's a particularly contentious issue?
No, that's why I'm making the point. But I think there was an issue that's relevant to this round, though. If we are causing problems on a global scale, we live in a globalized world. We have a duty to everybody in that world to talk to them about the problems. Furthermore, we have a duty to everybody in this world to allow them to advocate for themselves on those problems and make them aware, allow them to tell us that they've got, we're causing them problems and advocate against us causing those problems. So we think this is important, right? Even if it may not be particularly contentious.
Sure.
The second thing I want to talk about, and which we think has been a big issue in this round, is the value of culture in this society, and how culture is valued. Because we think that what culture does is it allows people to create identities, it allows people to make choices and develop their values, right? We think that essentially is the purpose and the function of culture in a lot of societies. Grounds people does a lot of good things, right? But we think that culture is only valuable in terms of the individual agent and what the individual agent understands. Couple of premises here. First off, we're going to say that the best person who knows what's best for them is that person themselves. So the only way that people can evaluate the impacts that various things have on them and whether something's particularly beneficial or not is the only person who can do that fully is that individual themselves. So we can't say necessarily that talking to them and providing them with information is necessarily bad. We can't say that they definitely would prefer to preserve their own culture instead of adopt new ones or allow their culture to change. We think cultural change is something that's fundamentally positive should people want to go that route. So we think when we introduce new information to different people, when we allow people to through dialogue to understand various things that we've experienced, if they then decide that that's a better, that kind of lifestyle is something that they want, we don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, because they have more information, because they're making a decision that's more in line with their ideas and more in line with the various options they have, we think that's actually a good decision for them to be making. Go.
Thanks. How many current indigenous populations, regardless of how they were contacted, would currently say, we are glad that we were contacted?
That's because, you can't say, in a lot of cases, that's because in addition to telling them about stuff, we said, you have to do this. We think, we can say, here are televisions and snowmobiles. If you want them, we'll give them to you. If you don't, that's fine. Or even if you don't want to talk to us ever again, we won't talk to you ever again, right? We can interact with people and allow them to decide how much more they want to interact with us, right? It's not, we just don't need to be as much bastards as we were before. So the third thing that I want to talk about, and I think this is important to the round, is can we do this in a safe and in a manner where we respect other cultures? And we think that we're in a unique position right now to do that because of two reasons. The first reason is we have an historical narrative that's been discriminatory, that's been problematic, and we're seeing the results of that now. So we can say that forcing Aboriginals into residential schools and trying to change their culture to be us, massively detrimental to them, and then we can take that information and use that to inform the way that we interact with other cultures. So we have the ability and knowledge to know that this interaction can be harmful if we enforce it on others, that not allowing a great deal of agency in these cases can be problematic. But beyond that, we think that the ethic that exists in society right now is beneficial to the extent that we're likely to do this. We've seen the kind of human rights international ethic and the Ph.Ds around how you deal with different populations and governments, and deal with sovereign populations and other ones, is one in which you respect their rights and their ability to do things and make their own self-deterministic decisions, right? So in this case, we think that we have an international ethic that allows us to interact with these populations in ways that respects their rights, respects the fact that they have individual agency, and we think that allows us to interact with them in a way that we haven't before, in a way that avoids all these problems that we've created in the past.
Sure.
So what have we got out of second opposition? Because I need to do some rebuttal. The first thing that Sean gets talks about is to an extent, interacting with them changes their framework and changes their reality. Like, yes, this is true. But we don't think that's necessarily problematic. In fact, we think that's a good thing. Because we think cultures are also valuable in terms of the way they're informed by reality. I mean, if you're facing a different kind of reality that changes the way that change your culture, then you should probably change your culture to respect that reality, but moreover, you deserve to know that reality is going to change your culture. And we think that most people would change their actions because something particularly harmful is happening. Sean says he doesn't want to know if aliens are around. I want to know if aliens are around because if they're putting a highway through the earth, that's something that impacts the way it's something that changes the way I act, right? So we think it's important to know kind of the reality that you're faced with because it allows you to make certain decisions that are more beneficial to you. So long as you're making decisions, we think this is fine. They said, oh, but they can initiate contact. But given the technological abilities of these people, probably not. And we think there's still value in them knowing and being aware of, and we think we can give them benefits here that they should be aware that they can receive. We think that so on our side, we think that so long as agency can be respected, we have a duty to inform people of the reality that they're facing. We have a duty to inform people that we're causing problems for them. Moreover, so long as we respect agency, we think it's perfectly fine to open up people to new ideas. And it's best that we open up people to new ideas because that's the way they're best able to make decisions in their own interest. For these reasons, we oppose.
I would like to thank the member for his speech, and invite the government whip to close the case for the proposition tables.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that so far in this round, we've heard quite a lot of possibilities, right? So we've heard a lot of possible harms that may occur, a lot of possible harms that may not occur. Now, we're very much in agreement with first proposition that a lot of possible harms are probable harms. So we think that the problems of disease, of probable exploitation, of cultural destruction, we think those are probably going to happen. Opposition gets up and says, look, we just don't know what's going to happen. It doesn't have to happen that way. But what I want to do for us is I want to bring the focus back to the harms that we know are inevitable, and also very importantly, I think, the risks that we are running in making this decision. Because the fact remains that we still don't really know how it's going to turn out, and there are some very important implications to that. So first of all, I want to say, well, which harms are inevitable? And Sean gives you at least one to begin with, and that's the psychological ones. So he would say to you, look, so not even imagine there's alien life out there, but imagine there's lots, in fact, about 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 times as many humans as us on other planets that already exist. What's more, they're much more advanced than we are. They're doing, in a certain sense, way better at mastering their environment and surviving and so on. Now, I think there is a definite psychological harm that results in, one, finding out that you are not the master of the world. You are suddenly nobody, and in fact, not only are you nobody, but you're behind the game. And I think that's just as soon as you find that out, that's really depressing, and in a way that probably does make you lose complete confidence in your culture. We think that's a harm that you get no matter how well we approach the situation. But apart from that, we also think that there are a lot of harms that are sort of risk-based, that are just well, what if this were to happen? So Sean also gets him and says to you, look, what if they respond to us violently? And all that opposition can say in response to that is well, what if we're really careful about it? But that being said, even if we're really careful about it, that may be what happens. I mean, for one thing, how do we even communicate with these people? Presumably, we don't speak the same language that they do. We know that body language and symbolism vary across cultures. So how can we know that we're going to be able to approach them in a way that they're going to perceive as benign rather than hostile, especially considering they're nobodies and we're these big, powerful people? I think we run the very serious risk that they're going to react negatively and possibly violently, and then what do? They're definitely going to die out in that kind of an encounter, because we're going to be in the position of having to defend ourselves. We think that those are harms that are a real risk, that are extremely grave, and I think perhaps it's our responsibility to that culture to not run the risk of annihilating them completely. We think we'd rather play it safe, let them continue developing, and then if they should discover us, well then that will be much better. And Sean tells you that too. So I think that that's like one enormous problem with opposition benches, is that at the end of the day, all they have for you is we can try as hard as we possibly can to mitigate these likely and devastating harms. We would say play it safe, don't run the risk at all. That's the responsibility that you have to do.
Sorry?
Jake.
You have to weigh this like societal depression against the massive harm to their autonomy as to how they want to integrate technology, whether they want to or not, into their culture.
I'll deal with it when I get there. Okay, second of all, I think we're here. So do we have a duty to them? So I think we get two visions of the duty that we might have. One of them is the human rights duty. Like, what if they're oppressing each other in some way that we find objectionable? We're going to say, first of all, we think it's unlikely that a group that's small enough to have survived this long in isolation is going to have lots of disparate elements of society. There could be, in one way or another, it's going to be a cohesive society that has managed to continue surviving in some way, which already suggests that whatever those harms are, they can't be all that bad, necessarily. What's more, we're going to say, look, all of this time, where have we been? We're all of a sudden coming in and saying, look, here are these values that you should love, and we're going to make you have them, and that's why it's our duty to ruin your lives. And we just think that's not really a good reason. Apart from that, the other potential duty we might have to them is the sinking island duty. Okay, so second off, guys, I really don't think that's what this round is about. It's actually about what if we suddenly discover a new culture that, by the way, is at the point of annihilation and it's our fault. I think that's clearly a completely different philosophical question than the one that we're actually addressing in this case. And honestly, that's all I'm going to say about it. Finally, let's move into can we do better? And this is where I'm going to talk about, Jake, choosing culture as well, so no thanks, is what that means. Well, I know it's probably different, but I don't want to take it. All right, so can we do better? Because that's an important question here, and I think Sean gives you the best answer to that question in this round, because he says to you, look, why don't we wait and see what happens next? Because it's possible that they will say, start getting onto their boats and moving to the nearest landmass, because maybe that's something that they will discover like other cultures have discovered in the past. Now, should they do that, notice there's a couple of clear benefits to that sort of thing. Because one, it means that they're encountering our culture in a way that is much less dramatic in a sense. It's less invasive and intrusive. So suddenly, instead of, we just showed up at their house, and they're like, who are you? They left their house and went out into the world to see what was out there, and then they found us. They might be prepared for the possibility of new things out in the unknown. They are drastically less prepared for the possibility of new things in their house all of a sudden. So we think that if we allow them to do that, one, it'll be better because it's less dramatic, it's slower. Two, it'll also be better because it means that those differences between us that will impede communication that I was talking to you about earlier are likely to be less dramatic then than they are now, because it means that they will have advanced to a stage of technology that is more similar to our own. Now, I understand that, look, that's kind of a small difference, but all the same, we say, look, wait for it to happen. What's the harm that's done in the meanwhile, really? Instead, they get to meet us when they're more similar to us, when they're expecting the possibility of something new, and then we don't run these massive risks at their expense based on the belief that we could do it right, maybe. So we're very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the government whip for his speech and invite the opposition whip to approach the front to close the opposition case and his round.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker. Okay, so how do I want to start? First, I want to look at a couple issues that came out in Star Wars, and then I'm looking at 4 different themes. So what did Star bring up? This kind of odd extension that Sean introduced, which is this idea that there's this huge metaphysical harm about learning when other people exist, right? We have a couple issues with this, because essentially what they said is you'll be harmed by learning that you're not God, right? And so a couple of responses. First of all, in terms of very, very repressive and autocratic societies that may exist in isolation, we think there's a benefit to people within those societies who are repressed and who do not have agency to learn that the person who represses them is not God, and to maybe learn that there are other things and other ways of living life that could be more beneficial to your agency and to the way in which you want to exist in that culture. I think that's beneficial. But beyond that, he just asserts that they'll be very harmed by learning that there's other people. This is the one example where historical things are actually on our side, right? You look at when developed nations go to places that were in isolation, they were really excited often by people who were new. Now, there was a problem, right? Because we were we're gods and then destroyed the Aztecs or whatever, right? However, what we're saying is that the metaphysical harm brought up, that you're going to want to kill yourself and you realize there's other people, in no way happened, right? So we don't buy this argument either. Now, what do I want to look at? First of all, what they say is discovering if they discover us, then that's fine, but we can't discover them. That's funny because a lot of the harms they talk about were just due to interaction in general. So really, I would have thought they wouldn't want them to discover us at all. But beyond that, what's interesting is that they're kind of saying it should be their choice. They should have agency in whether or not they interact with us. Which is funny, because that's kind of what we've been bringing up on side opposition, that agency is important, and that whether or not it's a Western notion, it's a Western obligation that we think that we should be fulfilling. Now, what are the 4 things I want to look at? 1, will we destroy them? 2, whether or not culture informs agency. 3, how globalization necessitates interaction. And 4th, this issue of static culture. So, will we destroy them, right? First of all, they posit that you cannot possibly have beneficial cultural interaction unless both cultures exist perfectly equally. We completely disagree, right? In terms of the Canadian multicultural context, I think we have a number of cultures that exist here, exist in very different proportions, and we deem that mosaic as very beneficial in terms of cultural interaction and cultural understanding. So we disagree with this point. But beyond that, what else do they say? Essentially, put their hat on this notion that they have so many good examples and we don't have any, right? This is a pretty new idea. And first of all, most of the examples they brought up were when we were total dicks, right? Most of the things, all these Aboriginal people that we interact with 150, 200 years ago, we dealt with it wrong. I think we've learned a lot.
On that point?
Now, what they argue is that we have one example of when it was done poorly in Brazil. I don't even know who went and did this. I don't know if they tried to have a beneficial model. But what I am going to argue is that one example of when it's done wrong hardly proves the fact that there's no way in which we could approach this, given the lessons that we've learned, in a positive and constructive way.
Sir.
We don't think there's been enough evidence on this side. Yes?
Thanks. Okay. It was the 1990s. It was anthropologists. Lastly, your entire model is based on is predicated on the idea that we've reached the post-exploitation phase of history. That's simply not true, sir.
Okay, we're not saying that there's in no way that exploitation ever happens. Exploitation does still happen. We're not arguing against it. We're saying that there is a possibility of not being exploitative all the time when we interact with new cultures. So there's a couple ways I'm going to argue this. First of all, I think there are precedents that show that we used to screw things up and then learn. This example isn't with humans, but we care about humans and animals as well. And so when we interact with animals often, for the first time, like new species that we discover, we used to hunt them out of hunt them to extinction and totally destroy them. Look what happens when we find new species like the Komodo dragon, right? Well, instead of doing a whole bunch of stuff that totally screws them up, we're you know what? We screwed up with the dodo, we screwed up with other things. How about we employ a conservationist perspective and try and protect these animals? I know it's not a civilization, but we think that it illustrates the fact that we can learn from previous mistakes and don't always have to exploit everything that we touch, right? The other thing that I want to go up is he's can you give us a good example of when this would happen? When is it a good idea? I take you to the example of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, right? So what we're going to argue essentially is that there can be cultures that we would say, whether or not it's a Western perspective, that those cultures in their existence can be so harmful to those individuals that we think intervention is a good idea, right? So if there's clear slavery, removing of hearts, terrible things, and people who are slaves there, child slaves, right? Really awesome movie. Slaves there who do clearly want to escape but cannot due to repression. We entirely disagree with the fact that that culture is way better off existing on its own, right? Certainly there are Aboriginal cultures that existed in North America that were generally happy and did hunting, gathering, and were well off. I think there's a number of isolated cultures that could exist that are very terrible in terms of agency, whether or not that's a Western notion. We consider intervention beneficial. Now what's the next thing I want to look at? The idea of how culture informs agency. So they said this Western, but that's okay, right? We don't think that it being Western is necessarily a problem. We think especially if we're Western nations and defining our own obligations, we're likely to use Western notions to define those obligations, right? And so what we're going to argue essentially is that, is this idea that, essentially what they argued is that there's only a societal context. happens. There's a culture that exists. What we're saying is that there's individuals within that culture, and we think that the culture that they appreciate is a very individual action. We think that whether or not there's a culture that is that they say is objectively important in its existence, if the majority of citizens within that culture are entirely repressed, it's a culture that's harmful to them objectively. Not every culture is necessarily good as a result of being a culture. We think that not having agency, especially from a Western perspective, having slavery within these cultures, having no women's rights, we think that all these things are bad things objectively from the perspective that we espouse, and we think as a result of that, we think that there's a justification in intervention. Not at this time. Now, what's the extension that we gave that they really don't want to debate about, right? First of all, they're like, we don't want to talk about that, and then front half says, that's not contentious. Great that it's not contentious. We agree, we think it's a big issue, because you're advocating no communication whatsoever. And if you do not communicate whatsoever, and there are harms that come as a result of the actions that we take in a globalized world, we think that in addition to the obligations I discussed, there's another obligation to tell them, to warn them, and on top of that, if you have a culture that's being destroyed by globalization or being destroyed by global warming, and we have no idea, that's an important voice on the international stage in terms of what's happening to us. Maybe that's a voice that should enter into the dialogue. Beyond that, it's not just sinking islands. That's just one thing. Maybe we're we want to test a nuke. We'll test it on this island. There's no one there, so it's okay, right? That's clearly going to harm all of them, no matter what kind of culture you want to protect. Now, what's the last thing that I want to talk about, right? It's the notion of a static culture. Because I think our argumentation has been very persuasive in terms of how culture is beneficial and how cultural interaction is beneficial. What Sean gets up and tells you is, no, interaction within your culture is beneficial, you learn lots, but cross-culturally is not. For no reason, right? We think that cross-cultural interaction is beneficial. We think being isolated within one culture, particularly, is very harmful because that culture can have a number of harms that you don't understand without a comparative analysis. We think that the integration and interaction of cultures is beneficial for finding the best culture for your own agency. For all these reasons, we stand proudly in opposition.
I would like to thank all the teams and invite them to cross the floor and shake hands.